The boardroom door slammed shut with a force that rattled the framed diplomas on the wall. Every head turned as Daniel Mercer marched in his polished leather shoes, striking against the marble floor with sharp precision. Without pause, he slapped his hand against the mahogany table, the sound reverberating like a judge's gavel. Then, with a smirk colder than the Chicago winter, he delivered his verdict. "You're finished here. Security will escort you out." The words detonated in the 29th floor chamber, hanging in the air like smoke after an explosion. Executives froze mid-sentence, their pens hovering, their eyes darting away. A throat cleared nervously down the table, then fell silent again. I stood there, not merely fired but discarded, in front of the very people whose careers I had safeguarded for decades. 18 years of service reduced to a single sentence. My name is Laura Bennett, and at 56 I was Northcrest Technologies' Senior Systems Director. When networks collapsed in the middle of the night, when multi-million-dollar contracts threatened to unravel, when deadlines pushed others to resign, I was the one who stayed. I had poured 4,212 hours of unpaid overtime into this company. Those hours stole birthdays, anniversaries, and hospital visits, moments of life that would never return. And yet here I stood, treated as though none of it had ever counted. Daniel never saw sacrifice. He thrived on image-tailored suits, family connections, speeches crafted by consultants. He never built. He performed. Investors applauded his polish while employees endured his neglect. Where I carried Northcrest on my back, he floated on unearned credit. We were opposites, and still it was his voice that erased me. The cruelty wasn't only in the firing, it was in the theater of it. Daniel staged the dismissal as a spectacle, hoping my humiliation would echo louder than my years of loyalty. Shock hit first, sharp and merciless. Humiliation followed, heavy and raw. But I refused to give him the satisfaction. I did not beg. I did not tremble. Instead, I let a slow, deliberate smile touch my lips. It was faint, but he noticed. For a fleeting instant, his arrogance cracked. Unease flickered across his face. He thought he had ended me. In truth, he had only begun to end himself. The silence of that boardroom followed me long after I left. But what cut deeper than the humiliation was the silence of the years I had already lost. People like to say, time is money, but I had learned the harder truth: time is life. And I had traded too much of mine for a company that treated me like a disposable line item. 18 years of devotion had not been measured in milestones or recognition. They were measured in hours. 4,212. Unpaid overtime hours I could never reclaim. Each one stolen from something that mattered far more than work. I didn't need a calendar to remind me of what I had missed. The losses were etched into me like scars. I remembered my mother's last Christmas. She had begged me to come home early. Instead, I stared at system alerts flashing across my screen while she sat by the tree waiting. I still see the empty space on the couch where I should have been. It haunts me every December. Then there was my younger brother, Michael. He battled heart problems with quiet resilience, but he did it mostly without me. While he lay in hospital corridors, I was trapped in data centers or board meetings that meant nothing now. I had promised him I'd visit the next weekend, but weekends never came when a network outage loomed. His voice grew weaker with every call, and I missed more moments than I can ever forgive myself for. The guilt weighed heavier than any midnight patch or emergency deployment I ever handled. And the cruel irony, Daniel and the board never noticed. They saw the results: systems restored, contracts, saved, projects delivered, but never the human toll it cost. That night, after being cast out, I opened my laptop. My hands trembled as I accessed the archive I had guarded for years, an ironclad record of every overtime hour logged, every approval email, every timestamp. Rows upon rows of numbers filled the screen. To anyone else, it was a spreadsheet. To me, it was a graveyard of time. But it wasn't only memory. It was evidence. Proof that I had sacrificed more than anyone had a right to ask. Proof that Northcrest's empire had been built on my stolen life. What Daniel dismissed as disposable was in fact undeniable. And as I scrolled through the evidence, pain gave way to something steadier. Resolve. Those 4,212 hours weren't only loss. They were leverage. Daniel thought he had ended me. He had no idea. What Daniel never realized was that my grief had also become my evidence. And evidence, unlike people, could not be erased. If my 4,212 hours had been invisible to him, they were not invisible to me. Daniel's comfort had blinded him. He was the kind of man who could walk into a server room at noon, see the lights humming, and never wonder who had been there since midnight. He didn't see the cold coffee cups left behind by exhausted engineers or the sacrifices that kept Northcrest from collapsing. He only saw polished floors, mirrored windows, and his own reflection smiling back. Daniel had always been a man of surfaces. His tailored suits fit like armor. His smile was rehearsed for investors. His speeches were crafted by consultants who earned more for a single deck of slides than some of us earned in a year. And behind all that polish was a truth I could never forget: Daniel built nothing. He only took credit for what others bled to deliver. I had built. I had coded until my eyes blurred architected systems that turned chaos into order and rescued multi-million-dollar contracts from collapse with fixes no one else could see. And Daniel, he stood on stage in perfect lighting and declared to the world, "Look what we achieved." But when he said we, he meant me. When he said achievement, he meant my sacrifice. That contrast was gasoline on the fire already burning inside me. If this chapter spoke to you, subscribe now, because the next part of this story isn't just mine, it could be yours too. I had given my life to keep Northcrest alive, and Daniel had turned me into a ghost in my own story. To him, employees weren't people, they were tools. Sharpened, used, and discarded once dull. I had seen him praise a young engineer one quarter, then fire her the next without hesitation. I had seen him look into the eyes of loyal staff and see only numbers in a spreadsheet. And in the cruelest twist, just 2 days after my dismissal, I learned how far he would go. A colleague forwarded me an internal announcement: Daniel was preparing to host an investor summit. The headline read, "A landmark presentation of Northcrest's breakthrough security platform." My platform. My code stitched together from every stolen hour. My sleepless nights woven into every layer. Daniel was polishing it as his crown jewel. Investors would applaud, shares would rise, and he would stand under the lights as though he had forged it himself. My anger hardened into something colder than rage. Being fired was one thing, but being erased from my own creation, that was unforgivable. His voice would be smooth polished, declaring victory with my work projected across the screen behind him. It wasn't just theft, it was theft under a spotlight. And in that moment, I swore the spotlight would be the very thing that consumed him. For days after being cast out, I drifted through the world in a haze. Anger simmered just beneath the surface. Daniel's voice echoed in my mind, his smug dismissal repeating like a curse I couldn't shake. But somewhere between grief and fury, a memory surfaced, faint at first, like a light in a pitch-black tunnel. Years ago, during one of Northcrest's endless policy updates, I had done what most employees never bothered with. I read every single page. It was a tedious stack of clauses, most written to protect the company, not its people. Yet buried deep in the sterile legal language, I had found one line that stopped me cold: equity allocation tied to documented overtime thresholds. At the time, it felt absurd. Who would ever cross the threshold they'd set? The number was astronomical, clearly designed to appear fair without ever being achievable. I remembered circling it in the margins of my printed copy, whispering to myself, what if, from that day forward, I began keeping meticulous records? Not just official time cards, those could be altered or erased. I saved approval emails authorizing late-night deployments. I archived calendar invites for emergency calls. I stored text messages ordering me to log in at 2 a.m. I kept server logs showing my activity when the office was dark and silent. Every shred of evidence was encrypted, mirrored across drives Daniel never even knew existed. At first, it was nothing more than private insurance, a quiet rebellion in a world where I had little control. But as the years piled on, so did the hours. I watched the total climb: 500, 1,000, 2,500. I stopped laughing when it crossed 3,000. By the time I hit 4212, the impossible threshold was no longer theoretical. It was real. And I had the proof. Daniel had taken my role and my dignity. What he didn't know was that with one arrogant decision, he had also handed me my weapon. My place in the company I had built piece by piece was gone. But Daniel didn't know about the clause. He had no idea that his empire was standing on foundations I had meticulously documented 1 hour at a time. I opened my laptop and pulled up the archive. Rows of files filled the screen: overtime logs, approval emails, timestamps, digital signatures. To anyone else, it would have looked like a spreadsheet. To me, it was a lifeline. For the first time since that humiliating day in the boardroom, something stirred in me that wasn't anger or grief. It was faint, fragile even, but undeniable hope. Daniel thought he had erased me, but buried in the fine print of a contract he never read, I had carved out my survival. And now it was time to use it. The memory of the clause burned in my mind as I replayed the scene. At the time, his dismissal had felt like a guillotine dropping swift, merciless final. But now, knowing what I knew, I realized it wasn't the end at all. It had been the trigger. I could see it clearly. Daniel standing tall at the head of the table pen, poised with theatrical arrogance. He had wanted a spectacle, a performance of dominance before his executives. He leaned down, pressed the pen to the termination letter, and scrawled his name with a flourish. The board members barely breathed as the ink bled onto the paper. To them, it was nothing more than a formality. To me, it was something else entirely. The clause in my contract didn't activate with hours alone. It required one final condition: termination by executive authority. His signature. The instant his pen touched that paper, Daniel hadn't just fired me. He had transferred equity worth billions into my hands. I remembered sitting there, pulse steady, despite the humiliation clawing at me. My colleagues might have thought I was frozen with shock. But inside, I was calm. Because while Daniel believed he was burying me, I knew the truth. He had just buried himself. My colleagues might have thought I was frozen in shock. But inside, I was calm, unnervingly calm. Because while Daniel believed he was burying me, I knew he was burying himself. There was a detail he hadn't noticed, but I had. When Daniel scrawled his name across the termination letter, his impatience betrayed him. Beneath the sharp letters of his signature, to the casual eye, it was nothing more than carelessness, but to me, it was priceless. It was physical proof that he had signed personally, proof the act couldn't be delegated, forged, or denied later in court. His arrogance had marked the document as much as the ink itself. I carried that image with me as if it were a talisman: the stroke of a pen, the smudge of ink, the sound of paper sliding across polished glass. It replayed in my mind like a secret anthem. That moment, once humiliating, now pulsed with anticipation. The executives had watched me leave with what they thought was quiet defeat. They hadn't seen the flicker of knowledge in my eyes or the steady rhythm of my breath. They didn't realize that as Daniel handed the letter to HR with a smug smile, he had also handed me the key to his empire. For nearly 2 decades, I had been the silent architect of Northcrest's survival. And now, Daniel's own hand had unknowingly made me its largest stakeholder. He didn't even know it. The irony steadied me. He believed the signature marked my end. In truth, it marked his. That smear of ink would be the scar he could never erase. The letter trembled faintly in my hand as I pushed my chair back, but my steps were steady. The glass door of the boardroom opened with a muted click, and every executive's eyes followed me as though I carried contagion. No one spoke. Their silence wasn't solidarity, it was survival. They had seen Daniel's wrath before, and none of them were willing to catch its flame. I could feel their stares burning into my back. Some averted their eyes quickly, desperate not to be caught looking. As though my dismissal were contagious, they looked away, afraid they might catch it if they stared too long. Others lingered, pity softening their expressions. But pity was a wound I refused to carry. If they had truly cared, they would have spoken when Daniel humiliated me. They hadn't. Their silence confirmed the truth. In that room, I had always stood alone. And yet, as I walked down the hallway, I realized aloneness gave me strength. The shame Daniel tried to pin on me didn't land. It slid off useless like his forced smile. Every step away from that boardroom, the power he thought he stripped from me pulsed back stronger. The hallway stretched long and sterile, its polished floors reflecting the fluorescent light. My heels clicked against the tile in a steady rhythm. Each strike echoed louder than any words I could have spoken inside. I didn't turn back. I didn't need to. Daniel had expected pleas, maybe even tears. Instead, he got something he couldn't touch: composure. Clusters of employees leaned near their office doors as I passed, curiosity spilling into whispers. Their eyes were wide, hungry for gossip, but none dared speak to me directly. I moved through their murmurs like smoke, untouched, unbothered. When I reached the elevator bank, a voice broke the silence. Not loud, but deliberate. One of the security guards, a man who had worked in the building longer than I, had leaned subtly toward me. His voice carried just enough for me to hear. I saw everything. He'll pay for this. I paused just briefly, long enough to let the words settle. He didn't ask for thanks, and I didn't offer any. But his whisper anchored itself deep in my chest. For the first time since that humiliating spectacle, I felt something shift. My battle hadn't been invisible after all. Someone had witnessed it. Someone had understood. And that meant the story Daniel thought he controlled was already slipping beyond his grasp. Someone had acknowledged the injustice. The elevator doors slid open and I stepped inside. My reflection stared back from the mirrored panel, cold, unbroken, steady. I let the silence wrap around me stronger than any armor I had ever worn. As the doors closed, I realized Daniel had mistaken quiet for weakness. He didn't understand that silence could be louder than rage, for witnesses to speak for justice, to build momentum in places he couldn't control. And when it came back, it wouldn't whisper. It would roar. The first 48 hours after I left the building passed in a blur. But underneath the numbness, a current of anticipation buzzed steadily. That same night, I had given my attorney both the termination letter and the overtime archive. By morning, the wheels were already in motion. It didn't take long for Northcrest's legal department to realize the scale of Daniel's mistake. One careless flourish of his pen had triggered the forgotten overtime clause, in black and white, backed by years of documented hours. Northcrest now owed me not a severance package, not a token settlement, but $2.7 billion in equity. Inside the legal office, panic spread like wildfire. Emails flew back and forth between executives and outside counsel. Subject lines screamed urgency clause, activation, immediate risk assessment, equity transfer, irreversible need, emergency strategy. One desperate thread even leaked to the press. We may have just handed her control. When that email chain surfaced publicly, I wasn't surprised. Companies like Northcrest thrived on secrecy, but panic always had a way of spilling into the open. Journalists pounced. By noon, headlines plastered financial sites. CEOs' signature may have triggered multi-billion-dollar transfer. Analysts called it unprecedented. Commentators debated whether I had orchestrated it deliberately or stumbled into extraordinary fortune. I sat quietly in my apartment, a mug of coffee cooling in my hands. Every headline carried Daniel's name, not mine. He had set out to make my dismissal a spectacle of power. But now the spectacle was his unraveling broadcast for the world to see, and each headline chipped away at the facade Daniel had built. He wanted my firing to be a performance of power. Now the performance was his unraveling broadcast for the world to see. Still, as the satisfaction grew, so did an uncomfortable question. I closed my laptop, staring at the ceiling, and whispered it into the empty room. If I take the $2.7 billion, am I any different from him? The thought unsettled me. Daniel had always consumed without care, feeding on the labor of others to polish his image. If I claimed the shares, was I doing the same, exploiting a loophole to strip something massive away and leaving chaos in my wake? For a moment, the number weighed heavily on me. $2.7 billion, enough to buy the life Daniel flaunted every day. And enough to haunt me if it turned me into what I despised. The doubt lingered, sharp and human. But then I opened the archive again. Thousands of hours logged, emails stamped urgent, timestamps proving I had carried Northcrest through storms that would have sunk it. This wasn't theft. It was restitution. Every line of data was a receipt. Every hour a debt long unpaid. By the time I shut the screen, my hands no longer trembled. The anticipation remained, but now it was steadier, tempered by clarity. Daniel thought I wanted revenge. What I wanted was balance, and balance was already tipping one leaked email at a time. Daniel never handled humiliation well, and the headlines following him everywhere carved deep cracks into his polished facade. Within days of the leak, he appeared before cameras, jaw-clenched, suit sharper than ever, venom in his voice. "She is a fraud," he declared to the press, spitting the word as though it could erase me. Laura Bennett manipulated data, twisted hours into false claims, and exploited a clause no real professional would ever use. She is nothing but a con artist chasing a payday. Watching from my living room, I felt anger rise hot and sharp. It wasn't just the insult, it was the predictability. Daniel always believed if he shouted loud enough, the world would believe him. That's how he had silenced dissent for years. But now, with the world watching, his bluster no longer carried weight. Because this time, I wasn't alone. Every major outlet already had copies of the contract. Analysts confirmed the legitimacy of the overtime clause, and legal experts repeated what I had always known. His signature made the transfer binding. Daniel could call me a fraud 1,000 times, but the paper trail contradicted him at every turn. Still, he pressed on, his temper fraying as the questions from the press grew sharper. "Are you saying the termination letter with your signature is invalid?" one reporter asked. His nostrils flared. "Are you denying her overtime records, all backed by company emails?" another demanded. Daniel tried to dodge, circling back to his talking points, but his composure slipped. Sweat gathered at his temples, and his confident smile thinned into something brittle. Then came the moment he couldn't take back. A reporter asked bluntly, if Laura Bennett wasn't critical, why did she log more overtime hours than any other employee in the company? Daniel snapped. His hand slammed against the podium, and with a burst of frustrated honesty he shouted, "Because she was the only real architect we had. She built the system." The silence that followed was deafening. Cameras clicked, microphones hummed. His admission hung heavy in the air. Daniel's face drained of color as he realized what he had done. In one careless outburst, he had confirmed what I had always been: the sole architect, the backbone, the builder. His words stripped the lies from his accusations and handed me the credibility he had tried so hard to destroy. By the time the clip spread online, public opinion had shifted. Viewers who once doubted me now saw through him. Comment sections filled with support. Analysts framed his words as a confession. Even employees inside Northcrest whispered their agreement. Daniel had tried to ruin me with labels fraud, opportunist, liar. Instead, his own tongue betrayed him, exposing the truth he could never swallow. And the truth was mine now, louder than his rage, undeniable in its clarity. Days later, the elevator doors opened on the 32nd floor, the same floor where Daniel had once stripped me of dignity. But this time, I did not walk in as an employee. I entered as the largest shareholder of Northcrest Technologies. The boardroom looked the same: glass walls, gleaming polished tables stretching long, executives lined in their familiar seats. But everything had changed. I was no longer the ghost they had dismissed. My name now appeared in bold across the shareholder registry: Laura Bennett, $2.7 billion equity holder. And as I stepped through the door, the air shifted. The air shifted. Conversations halted. Pens stopped moving. Every gaze turned to me. But this time, there was no pity, no discomfort. There was calculation, recognition, even unease. They knew I had come not as a casualty, but as a force. Daniel sat at the head of the table, his shoulders stiff, his smile pulled tight like thread ready to snap. He tried to mask it with confidence, but his eyes betrayed panic. He had expected me to fade, to vanish in humiliation. Instead, I was here to vote, to decide, to tilt the balance of power. I slid into a seat across from him, calm and deliberate. My silence carried weight now. It was no longer the silence of dismissal, but of authority. The chairman cleared his throat, his voice faltering as he began. "We convene today to discuss the leadership of Northcrest Technologies." Daniel cut him off, his voice hard. "This is absurd. She doesn't belong here. She's an opportunist, not a leader." But his words no longer landed. Every director in that room had seen the headlines. They had read his accidental confession at the press conference. They had watched the stock tremble as his credibility fractured. And now they saw me poised, calm, holding billions in equity that gave me more power than Daniel's words ever could. I leaned forward slightly, letting the silence stretch before I spoke. "You fired me as an employee, but you signed away your control. I'm not here to ask for permission. I'm here to exercise my rights." The effect was immediate. Executives exchanged glances, weighing their choices in real time. The man who once inspired fear now looked small, cornered. And he said clearly, "I cast my vote with her." The room cracked open. Chairs shifted. Whispers erupted. The dominoes began to fall. Others followed, voices steady, deliberate. One by one, they aligned not with Daniel, but with me. Each declaration chipped away at the empire he had believed unshakable. For the first time, Daniel's mask collapsed completely. Rage flickered across his face, but behind it lay the truth he could no longer deny. His grip on power was gone. I didn't need to raise my voice. I simply sat taller, watching the tide turn. The boardroom that had once been the place of my humiliation had become my throne. The vote was decisive. One by one, the directors' voices fell like stones into a well, and each one landed against Daniel. His last allies hesitated, their eyes darting nervously between me and him before finally conceding to the tide that could no longer be stopped. When the final tally was read, the verdict was clear. Daniel Mercer was stripped of his authority. He sat at the head of the table, the seat that once radiated dominance now reduced to a hollow throne. His shoulders sagged, his jaw clenched, but no words came. Around him, the directors turned away, avoiding his gaze, isolating him in the very space where he had thrived on control. For the first time, Daniel was truly alone. Across from him, I took a measured breath and settled into my chair. On the massive screen behind us, the shareholder registry updated in real time. And then it appeared bold and undeniable: Laura Bennett, $2.7 billion equity holder. The glow of those words filled the room with a gravity impossible to ignore. Executives stared, some in disbelief, others in quiet relief, as if they had been waiting for this shift all along. My silence carried the final authority. I didn't need to raise my voice. The weight of my name was louder than any speech Daniel had ever given. When the meeting adjourned, I rose calmly. Daniel didn't follow. He couldn't. The man who had once humiliated me in this very space now had no stage left. Outside the building, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my old employee badge. Once a symbol of belonging, now nothing but a relic of servitude. I turned it over then with deliberate calm, tossed it into a trash bin by the steps. The sun had just crested the skyline, bathing the street in soft light. I tilted my head back, breathing deeply. For the first time in years, I felt the weight lift. 212 hours finally returned. I've carried this story for years, but now it's in your hands. If you believe no one should lose decades of loyalty for the arrogance of one man, stand with me. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you would have done in my place, or share your own story of being overlooked. Your words remind people like me that silence is not weakness. And let this be a lesson: protect your time, guard your worth, and never let anyone write you out of your own story again.